Princess Velith of the Jorvani Empire was dying, and everyone in the galaxy knew it. She sat alone in the crystal halls of her father's magnificent palace, her once radiant skin now dull and gray like old stone left in the rain for too many seasons. The princess had been called the most beautiful creature in 12 star systems, and poets from 100 worlds had written songs about her glowing wings that shimmered with colors no artist could ever capture on canvas. But now those wings hung, limp and lifeless against her back, and the light that once danced across her translucent skin had faded to almost nothing. King Zorath watched his daughter from across the throne room and felt his 4 hearts breaking one by one. He had ruled the Jorvani Empire for 3,000 years and had conquered worlds and built alliances that stretched across the entire galaxy. But none of his power could save his only child from the strange illness that was slowly taking her away from him. The royal physicians had examined her countless times, and they had run every test known to their advanced civilization, but they could find nothing physically wrong with her body. "Your Majesty," the chief physician had said with great sadness in his voice, "the princess suffers from no disease we can identify, and her organs function perfectly, and her blood carries all the nutrients she needs. Then why does she waste away before my eyes?" The king had demanded. The physician had lowered his head and spoken words that haunted the king every night, since the Jorvani are empathic feeders. "Your Majesty, and we do not simply consume food for energy like lesser species do, and our bodies require an emotional connection to what we eat, and without joy in consumption, there can be no true nourishment, and the princess has lost the ability to feel anything when she eats." King Zorath had not understood at first, because food was food and eating was eating, and how could emotions have anything to do with staying alive? But as he watched Velith push away plate after plate of the finest cuisine in the galaxy, he began to understand what the physician meant. His daughter would take a bite of the most exquisite dishes prepared by master chefs from across the stars, and her face would show nothing but emptiness, and she would set down her utensils and turn away. As if the food had personally insulted her, the king summoned healers from every corner of his empire. The Meldorians came first with their famous enzyme therapies that could cure almost any ailment of the digestive system, but Velith remained unchanged after their treatments. The Quillari arrived next with quantum-infused supplements that they claimed could restore vitality to any living being, but the princess simply grew thinner. The ancient Vorthax even performed sacred rituals and sacrificed 3 entire moons to their hunger gods in hopes of blessing the princess with appetite, but their prayers went unanswered. Species after species tried and failed, and the princess continued to fade like a star. Running out of fuel, in desperation, King Zorath issued a decree that echoed across every communication channel in the known galaxy. "Hear me, beings of all worlds." His voice boomed through countless speakers on countless planets. "My daughter, Princess Velith, suffers from a malady that no physician can cure, and she has lost the desire to eat and grows weaker with each passing day. And I hereby declare that any being who can restore my daughter's appetite and make her want to eat again shall be granted a single wish, and anything within my considerable power shall be theirs." The response was immediate, and overwhelming ships from every corner of the galaxy began making their way to Jorvan Prime, and they carried chefs and healers and mystics and scientists, all hoping to claim the king's reward. Some came for wealth beyond imagination, and others came for political power, and a few came simply for the glory of succeeding where so many had failed. They brought dishes that had taken years to prepare, and food so rare that entire wars had been fought over their ingredients, and they brought molecular concoctions designed by the greatest culinary scientists in existence. One by one, they presented their offerings to the princess. One by one, they failed. A chef from the Nebula Collective prepared a dish that contained the essence of a dying star captured at the exact moment of its collapse, and Velith took one bite and felt nothing. A healer from the Mindari Consortium created a soup that was supposed to stimulate pleasure, centers directly in the brain, and the princess drank it and remained as empty. As before, a mystic from the Order of Eternal Hunger performed rituals over a sacred fruit that had been growing for 10,000 years, and Valeth bit into it and tasted only ash. 743 attempts were made in the first month. Alone, and 743 times, the princess turned away from the food placed before her. King Zorth began to lose hope. His advisors whispered that perhaps it was time to accept the inevitable and to prepare the empire for a future without their beloved princess. But the king refused to give up on his daughter, and he kept the decree active, and he kept welcoming anyone who wanted to try. Far across the galaxy, in a region of space that most advanced civilizations considered barely worth noticing, a battered cargo ship called the Lucky Dumpling drifted between stations, picking up odd jobs and barely making enough to keep flying. The ship's pilot and sole crew member was a human named Marcus Chen, and he was listening to a scratchy transmission while eating cold noodles from a container that had seen better days. The transmission was old news by the time it reached his part of space, but Marcus listened with growing interest as the king's decree played through his speakers. A princess who had lost the will to eat, and a reward of anything one could wish for, and countless failures from the greatest minds in the galaxy. Marcus slurped his noodles and thought about his grandmother and the tiny kitchen where she had taught him everything he knew about food. He thought about how she used to say that the fanciest restaurant in the world could never compete with a meal made with love. He thought about how his mother had cried while making dumplings on Mars because the smell reminded her of home, and then Marcus Chun made a decision that would change the galaxy forever. He set a course for Jorvan Prime and pushed his old ship as fast as it would go. He had no special ingredients and no advanced techniques and no mystical powers, but he had his grandmother's walk and his mother's recipes, and a feeling in his gut that maybe what the princess needed was something no alien had ever thought to offer her, something human. The Lucky Dumpling dropped out of faster-than-light travel with a sound that made Marcus wince because the engine had been making that noise for 6 months, and he still had not saved enough credits to fix it. Through his viewport, he saw Jorvan Prime for the first time, and his breath caught in his throat despite himself. Planet was beautiful beyond anything he had ever seen, with swirling clouds of purple and gold and massive crystal structures that rose from the surface and caught the light of 3 suns. His ship looked like a piece of garbage floating next to a precious jewel, and Marcus knew that everyone on the planet below would probably agree with that assessment. He guided the Lucky Dumpling toward the coordinates the transmission had provided, and as he descended through the atmosphere, he passed ships that probably cost more than his entire life savings multiplied by 1,000. The landing zone near the palace was crowded with vessels from across the galaxy, and Marcus had to circle 3 times before finding a spot that would fit his modest ship. When he finally sat down and lowered the boarding ramp, he was greeted by the sight of beings from dozens of different species, all waiting in line to present their offerings to the princess. Some carried containers that hummed with energy fields, designed to keep their contents in perfect condition, and others had entire teams of assistants managing complex cooking equipment, and a few had armed guards protecting ingredients that were obviously worth more than most planetary economies. Marcus walked down his ramp, carrying a battered canvas bag and a walk that had been in his family for 4 generations. The looks he received ranged from confusion to amusement to outright contempt. A massive crustacean being in elaborate robes approached him, and Marcus recognized the ceremonial dress of a high-ranking palace official. "State your name and species," the chamberlain demanded, his mandibles clicking with each word. "Marcus Chan, and I'm human from Earth originally, though I grew up mostly on Mars." The chamberlain consulted a device that floated beside him, and his compound eyes narrowed. "Human," he repeated as if the word itself was slightly distasteful. "Your species achieved faster than light travel only 3 generations ago, and you are considered among the most primitive of the spacefaring races. That sounds about right. Marcus. Agreed. And you believe that you can succeed where the greatest culinary minds in the galaxy have failed. Marcus shrugged and adjusted the strap of his bag on his shoulder. Probably not, he admitted. But I have got nothing to lose, and my ship needs fuel anyway, and I figured worst case. I get a free meal out of it myself. The Chamberlain stared at him for a long moment, and his mandibles clicked several times in what might have been laughter or disbelief or both. Your honesty is refreshing, human, even if your chances are non-existent. The Chamberlain finally said, "Very well, you may join the queue, and when your turn comes, you will have one opportunity to present your offering to the princess." Marcus nodded his thanks and found a spot in line behind a being that appeared to be made entirely of crystallized light. The wait was long, and Marcus used the time to observe the other contestants as they made their attempts. Watched a chef from a species he did not recognize present a dish that floated in mid-air and changed colors as it was consumed, and the princess took one bite and shook her head. He saw a team of scientists unveil a food that had been engineered at the molecular level to trigger every pleasure receptor in the Giovanni brain, and Valith tasted it and felt nothing. He witnessed a mystic perform an elaborate ceremony over a single piece of fruit that glowed with inner light, and the princess ate it and remained as empty as before. Each failure made the competitors around Marcus more nervous, and several of them abandoned the line entirely rather than face the humiliation of rejection. But Marcus stayed, and he watched, and he thought about what he was seeing. All of these beings were trying to overwhelm the princess with perfection, and they were using the most advanced techniques and the rarest ingredients and the most complex preparations imaginable, and none of it was working. When his turn finally came, Marcus walked forward into the royal kitchen and found himself surrounded by equipment that made his grandmother's cooking tools look like artifacts from ancient anti-gravity prep stations floated at perfect heights, and synthetic protein fabricators hummed with quiet efficiency, and devices he could not even identify blinked with lights and made soft sounds. A palace official gestured toward the equipment. "You may use any of the facilities provided, and we have ingredients from 10,000 worlds available upon request." Marcus looked around at all the gleaming technology, and then he set his bag down on a simple counter and pulled out his grandmother's wok. "I just need a heat source," he said, "and some privacy if you do not mind." The official blinked several times in confusion. "You do not wish to use the molecular restructuring array or the flavor optimization system or the presentation mapping interface?" "No, thank you. But human, those tools can create any dish from any world with perfect precision." Marcus smiled and placed his wok on a heating element that looked like it was designed for far more sophisticated cookware. "Perfect is not really what I am going for." The official hesitated, clearly unsure whether to allow this strange approach. But the king's decree had been clear that any being could try any method they wished. "Very well, human, you have 3 hours to prepare your offering, and the prince's will be summoned when you are ready." When the official left, Marcus opened his bag and began to unpack the treasures he had carried across the stars. There was a packet of dried shiitake mushrooms that his mother had given him when he left Mars, and she had told him to save them for a special occasion. There was a jar of fermented black beans that his grandmother had made herself, using a recipe that had been in the family for 6 generations. There was a small container of chili crisp that his aunt had prepared with peppers she grew illegally on her apartment balcony because she said real food needed to break a few rules, and there was a bag of rice so old and so precious that his family had carried it from Earth to Mars to the stars themselves, treating it like the sacred relic it was. Marcus laid out his ingredients and looked at them for a long moment. They were simple things, and nothing about them was rare, exotic, or molecularly engineered, but they were real, and they were his, and they carried the love of everyone who had touched them. Before him, he lit the flame beneath his grandmother's wok and began to cook. Princess Valeth lay on her resting couch in her private chambers and stared at the ceiling with eyes that had long since stopped seeing the beauty of the crystal patterns above her. She had met another 12 hopefuls today, and each one had failed. Just like all the others before them, the Giovanni princess had stopped counting after the first 500 attempts, and now they all blurred together into one endless parade of disappointment. She remembered a time when food had brought her joy and when the simple act of eating had filled her with warmth and connection, but that time felt like it belonged to someone else, and Valeth could no longer recall what it had felt like to actually want to take a bite of anything. Her handmaidens worried constantly, and they tried to tempt her with small portions of her childhood favorites, but even those dishes that had once made her eyes light up with happiness now tasted like nothing at all. The royal physicians visited twice daily, and they measured her vital signs and shook their heads and spoke in hushed tones about how much longer she could possibly survive. Valeth had stopped caring about their predictions because, in a way, she had already stopped living, and her body was simply taking its time to catch up with her spirit. She closed her eyes and prepared to drift into the empty sleep that was the only escape she had left. And then something strange happened. A scent reached her chambers, and it was unlike anything she had ever experienced before. It was not the sterile perfection of fabricated cuisine that had no smell at all until the moment it touched your tongue. It was not the overwhelming alien spices that previous hopefuls had used to try to shock her deadened senses back to life. This scent was warm and complex, and somehow alive in a way she could not explain. Valeth opened her eyes and found herself sitting up without consciously deciding to do so. The smell curled through the air like a living creature, and it carried something with it that she could not identify. It made her think of things she had never experienced and places she had never been. She imagined a small room filled with steam and warmth, even though she had never seen such a room in her life. She imagined hands weathered by time and work moving with practiced grace over simple ingredients. She imagined laughter and tears and arguments and reconciliations all happening around a table where food was shared. These were not her memories, because she had never experienced any of these things in her perfect crystalline palace, but somehow she knew they were real, and they were calling to her. Valeth stood up from her resting couch, and her handmaidens gasped in surprise, because she had not risen on her own in weeks. "Your Highness," one of them said with worry in her voice, "please, you should rest and conserve your strength." But Valeth was already walking toward her chamber door, and her legs felt stronger than they had in months. She followed the scent through the palace. Corridors and servants stopped and stared as she passed because the princess had not been seen outside her chambers in so long. Smell grew stronger as she walked, and with each step she felt something stirring inside her that she had thought was dead forever. She turned a corner and found herself at the entrance to the royal kitchens. Through the doorway she could see a small figure standing at a primitive heating element, and he was moving in a way that seemed almost like a dance. The being was tiny compared to most species she had encountered, and his skin was a strange pinkish color, and he had hair only on the top of his head. A human, she realized with some surprise, because she had never met one of those before. The human was singing something soft in a language she did not recognize, and occasionally he would taste from a worn metal spoon and make small adjustments to whatever he was cooking. He moved with a rhythm that seemed almost ceremonial, and there was a focus in his eyes that she had never seen in any of the professional chefs who had tried to feed her before. Valeth stepped into the kitchen doorway, and the human spoke without turning around. "It is not ready yet, but if you want to watch, you can." The princess was taken aback by his casual tone, because no one had spoken to her that way in her entire life. She was royalty, and beings were supposed to address her with proper respect and deference. But this human acted as if she was just another person who had wandered into his kitchen. "You presume much human," she said, and her voice came out stronger than she expected. The human glanced back at her, and his eyes held no reverence and no fear and no desperate hope. There was only warmth in his gaze, like the warmth of the scent that had drawn her here. "I presume nothing," he said with a small smile. "I am just making dinner." He turned back to his work and stirred something in his battered metal pan. "Have you ever watched someone cook before?" he asked. "Not fabricate and not synthesize, but actually cook." Lilith considered the question and realized she had no answer in her entire life. Every meal had appeared before her fully formed and perfectly presented, and she had never once witnessed the process of its creation. "Come here," the human said, and he gestured to the space beside him. "I want to show you something." It was not a request befitting her station, and any of her advisors would have been horrified by his lack of protocol. But Valith found herself walking forward anyway, because something about this strange small being made her want to see what he would do next. She stood beside him and looked down at the simple ingredients laid out on the counter. They were ugly things, and nothing like the perfect symmetrical food she was used to seeing. There was a gnarled root that looked like it had been pulled from dirt and dried, plants that were wrinkled and brown, and a jar of something dark and pungent that smelled stronger up close. "These do not look like food," she said. The human laughed, and it was a genuine sound full of warmth. "They do not look like much," he agreed. "But looks are not really the point." He picked up the gnarled root and held it up for her to see. "This is ginger, and it is ugly and lumpy, and it smells kind of aggressive, and your fabricators could make a perfect version of it in seconds." Valith nodded because he was right about that. "But my grandmother grew this on her balcony in a city called Taipei on a planet called Earth," the human continued. "And she was not supposed to grow food there because there were rules against it, but she did it anyway, because she said food needed to come from somewhere real." He began to peel the ginger with a small knife, and his movements were practiced but imperfect. Every piece of this root carries the sun that helped it grow, and the soil it pushed through, and the hands that pulled it from the earth. And your fabricators can copy the molecules, but they cannot copy that. He added the ginger to his pan, and the sizzle was somehow both violent and comforting at once. And Princess Velith, who had not felt hunger in 2 years, found herself leaning closer to see what would happen next. Marcus Chen had cooked for many people in his life, but he had never had an audience quite like Princess Velith. She stood beside him at the cooking station, and her large, luminescent eyes followed every movement of his hands with an intensity that might have made a lesser cook nervous. But Marcus had learned long ago that cooking was not about perfection, and it was not about impressing people with fancy techniques. Cooking was about telling a story with your hands and sharing a piece of yourself with whoever was going to eat what you made. He reached for the packet of dried shiitake mushrooms and held them up so the princess could see. "My mother gave me these when I left Mars to become a cargo hauler," he said. "She told me to save them for a special occasion, and I have been carrying them across the galaxy for 3 years, waiting for the right moment." He placed the mushrooms in a bowl of warm water to rehydrate them, and the liquid immediately began to turn dark with their essence. "Why did you wait so long?" Valith asked, and there was genuine curiosity in her voice. "Because using them means I cannot save them anymore," Marcus explained. "And once they are gone forever, and I will never taste this exact flavor again because these specific mushrooms grew in a specific place at a specific time, and that moment can never be recreated." The princess tilted her head in confusion. "But surely you could obtain more mushrooms." "I could get other mushrooms, yes, but they would not be these mushrooms. And they would not carry my mother's hands packing them into this bag, or her tears as she said goodbye, or her hope that I would find happiness among the stars." Marcus could see that the concept was strange to her, and he understood why the Giovanni had perfected the art of replication, and they could create exact copies of anything down to the molecular level too. Then the idea of something being irreplaceable was almost incomprehensible. He picked up the jar of fermented black beans and removed the lid so she could smell the pungent aroma inside. My grandmother made these using a recipe that has been in my family for 6 generations, he said. A grandmother taught her mother, who taught her, who taught my mother, who taught me. 6 generations seems like a short time. Valeth observed. Marcus smiled because to a being who lived for thousands of years, it probably did seem brief. Humans do not live very long compared to most species, he acknowledged. Maybe 80 or 90 years if we are lucky, and that is not much time to leave a mark on the universe. He spooned some of the black beans into the wok where they sizzled and released their complex fragrance. But we figured out a long time ago that we could make ourselves last longer through the things we pass down, and every time I use this recipe, I am cooking alongside my grandmother and her grandmother and all the grandmothers before them. The princess was quiet for a moment, and Marcus could see something shifting in her expression. The food fabricators on this world can create any dish from any species in the galaxy, she said slowly, and they can replicate it perfectly every single time with no variation. That sounds convenient, Marcus said. It is efficient. Valeth agreed. But now I wonder if efficiency is the same as good. Marcus added the rehydrated mushrooms to the wok and stirred everything together with practiced movements. Let me tell you about this chili crisp, he said, as he opened the small container, and the spicy aroma joined the other smells. Already filling the kitchen, my aunt makes this on Mars in her apartment, and she grows the peppers herself on her balcony, which is definitely not allowed because there are strict regulations about residential food production. She breaks the law to grow peppers. Valeth asked with surprise. She does, and so did my grandmother before her, and probably a grandmother before that, and every generation of my family has found ways to grow things they were not supposed to grow because we believe that food should be a little bit rebellious. He drizzled the chili crisp into the wok, and the oil crackled and popped. Humans have a saying that rules are meant to be broken, and we do not really mean that all rules should be ignored, but we mean that sometimes the most important things in life exist in the spaces where rules do not reach. The princes watched as Marcus began to prepare the rice, and this was the part of the cooking he had been most nervous about. The rice was old and precious, and it had traveled farther than any grain of rice had any right to travel. This rice has been in my family since we left Earth, he said quietly. My great-great-grandmother carried it with her when she boarded the first colony ship to Mars, and every generation since has kept some and passed it on. Why would you carry rice across space? Valeth asked. Because rice is more than food to us, Marcus replied. It is home, and it is memory, and it is the promise that no matter how far we travel, we will always have a piece of where we came from. He measured out a portion of the rice carefully and began to cook it with the reverence it deserved. Every grain in this bag is connected to every meal my family has ever shared, and when I cook with it, I am not just making dinner. I am participating in a tradition that stretches back thousands of years to farmers and fields on a planet I have never even visited. The wok sizzled and the rice steamed, and the kitchen filled with the scent of something that was more than just food. It was history and love and loss and hope, all mixed together in one simple meal. Marcus plated the dish with none of the artistic flourishes the palace chefs would have used, and there was no molecular restructuring or flavor optimization or presentation mapping. It was just rice and vegetables and sauce, arranged on a plate by human hands. He said it before the princes and stepped back. It is not much, he admitted, and it is probably not as impressive as the other things you have been offered. Valeth looked at the plate, and then at Marcus, and then back at the plate. You made this for me, she said. I did. Why? Marcus thought about the question for a moment before answering. Because you looked like you needed someone to cook for you, and not for a reward or for glory, or because you are a princess, but just because cooking for someone is how humans show that we care." The princess picked up the utensil Marcus had provided, and she held it over the plate for a long moment. Then, she took her first bite, and everything changed. The first bite made Princess Velith cry. This should have been impossible because the Giovanni did not produce tears, and their biology simply was not designed for that kind of emotional expression. But something warm and wet rolled down her gray cheeks as the flavors bloomed across her tongue, and she did not even try to stop it. The taste was remarkable, but it was not the taste that overwhelmed her. It was everything else. She could feel the sunlight from a yellow star she had never visited, warming the soil where the ginger had grown. She could sense the love of women she had never met passing their knowledge down through generations. Like the most precious inheritance imaginable, she could taste the stubborn hope of a species that had crawled out of their own gravity, while through sheer determination, and had refused to leave their memories behind. No matter how far they traveled, the dish was imperfect, and the rice was slightly sticky, and the sauce was a touch too salty. But those imperfections were not flaws, and they were signatures. They were proof that a real person with real hands and real feelings had made this food for her. Specifically, every flaw carried a fingerprint, and every inconsistency told part of a story. Velith took another bite, and then another, and the colors in her skin began to shift. The gray that had dominated her complexion for 2 years started to fade, and hints of the luminescent glow she had once been famous for began to emerge. She did not notice the change herself because she was too focused on the food in front of her. Each mouthful brought new sensations and new connections. She tasted the tears of a mother saying goodbye to her son as he left for the stars. She felt the warmth of a kitchen where generations of family had gathered to share meals and stories. She experienced the quiet rebellion of growing peppers on a balcony where they were not supposed to grow. And underneath it all, she sensed something she had never encountered in any food before: love. Not the abstract concept of love that poets wrote about in their songs, but real tangible love that had been stirred into the food by hands that knew what it meant to care for someone. Marcus watched the princess eat, and he felt a warmth spreading through his chest. He had not known if this would work, and he had not even really believed it was possible. But seeing the color return to her skin and the light begin to glow in her wings made every kilometer he had traveled worth it. Velith finished the first plate and looked up at him with eyes that were brighter than they had been in years. "More," she said, and it was not a royal command but a simple request from someone who had finally found what she had been starving for. Marcus smiled and turned back to his walk, coming right up by the third bowl. The princess's skin was glowing with colors that her handmaidens had not seen since before her illness began. By the fifth bowl, her wings had begun to shimmer with bioluminescent patterns that danced and shifted with her emotions. The commotion in the kitchen had attracted attention, and palace servants had gathered at the doorway to witness what was happening. Word spread quickly through the palace, and soon King Zorath himself came rushing through the corridors. He burst into the kitchen expecting to find another failure, and instead he discovered something miraculous. His daughter was laughing. Velith stood at the cooking station, covered in flour, while the small human showed her how to fold dumplings, and she was laughing with a joy that the king had thought he would never hear again. "You pinch the edges like this," Marcus was saying as he demonstrated the technique. "And do not worry if they are not perfect, because the ugly ones always taste the best." The princess attempted to copy his movements and produced a dumpling that looked more like a small explosion than a piece of food. She laughed again, and the sound filled the king's 4 hearts with more happiness than he had felt in 2 years. "Father," Velith called when she noticed him standing in the doorway. "The human is teaching me to make dumplings, and they are very difficult, but also very fun." King Zorath approached slowly, as if afraid that any sudden movement might break the spell. He looked at his daughter and saw the vibrant, glowing princess she had been before her illness had stolen her away. Then he looked at the human who had achieved what the greatest minds in the galaxy could not. The wish, the king said, and his voice trembled with emotion. Name it human, and anything within my power to grant shall be yours. Marcus looked up from his dumpling lesson and considered the question for a moment. He could ask for wealth beyond imagination, or a fleet of ships or entire worlds to rule. The king had conquered star systems and built empires, and his power was nearly limitless. Can I have a kitchen? Marcus finally said. A real one, with actual ingredients from actual plants, and not just fabricators and synthesizers. The king stared at him in disbelief. You want a kitchen, and permission to come back and cook sometimes, Marcus added, with a glance at the princess, who was enthusiastically destroying another dumpling wrapper. She has a lot to learn, and we have not even gotten the pasta yet. Valith looked up at her father with flour on her royal cheek, and her wings blazing brighter than they had in years. Father, she said with new strength in her voice, I want to learn to make the thing with the noodles. The king looked at his daughter, and then at the human, and then at the simple battered wok that had done what molecular restructuring arrays and quantum-infused supplements and sacred rituals could not. You could have asked for anything, the king said quietly. You could have asked for power or riches or influence beyond measure. Marcus shrugged and smiled. I just really like cooking, and it is better when you have someone to cook for. The king granted his wish, and more besides. The lucky dumpling was given a permanent berth in the palace. Landing zone and the royal kitchen was completely renovated to include primitive cooking equipment alongside the advanced technology. Marcus became a regular visitor to Jovan Prime. And each time he came, he taught the princess something new. She learned to make noodles and stir-fry and soup and bread and 100 other dishes that had never been created by fabricators. And his word of what had happened spread across the galaxy. Something remarkable began to occur. Other species began to seek out human cooking, and they wanted to taste what the princess had tasted. They wanted to experience food that carried love and memory and imperfection. Human restaurants opened on space. Stations across the galaxy and cooking schools with human instructors had waiting lists that stretched for centuries. The phrase made with love was translated into 14,000 languages and became the most requested quality in cuisine across known space. And on Jorvan Prime, Princess Valith took a new name for herself. Chef V. She told the galaxy as she served her imperfect, beautiful food to anyone who was hungry for something more than mere sustenance. Marcus says everyone needs a chef name. She never went hungry again, and neither did anyone who sat at her table. Because humans did not conquer the galaxy with warships or superior technology. They conquered it one meal at a time. They carried their grandmothers' recipes across the stars and proved that the most powerful force in the universe was not fusion or antimatter or quantum manipulation. It was a home-cooked meal made by someone who loved you, and that was something no fabricator in the galaxy could ever replicate.